At my sister-in-law's wedding, my mother-in-law tried to shame me by asking me to translate the entire ceremony in French. She thought I'd stumble and humiliate myself. But I did it flawlessly, and her friends whispered, "Is she a diplomat or something?" "Are you sure about this?" Marcus whispered to me as we stood near the floral arch set up by the waves, his hand gently brushing mine. His voice was low enough that none of the milling guests could hear. I glanced toward his mother, Vera, who stood stiffly near the drinks table in a coral sheath dress and that signature smug expression of hers. She pretended to sip her wine while watching me out of the corner of her eye. "I've got this," I told him. "Let her watch." He looked worried. I could tell he wanted to say something more, but like always with his family, he retreated behind politeness and nodded. That's what Marcus did. He avoided conflict. But I had been through too much with Vera to play nice anymore. "My name's Genevieve. I'm 42, Canadian by birth, fluent in French, and married to an American, Marcus, who's 44. We live in Portland, Oregon now. I moved here over a decade ago when Marcus and I got serious. Before that, I'd spent years working in Brussels as a translator and interpreter for business conferences. It was stressful, fast-paced, and surprisingly political. But I was good at it, and I'm not one to rattle under pressure. Vera, my mother-in-law, never liked me. From the moment she first met me, she saw me as a problem. Too foreign, too opinionated, too independent. I didn't grow up in a small Midwestern town like Marcus. I didn't bake banana bread for potlucks or belong to a Bible study group. I had opinions and a strong accent and no desire to fit in. I think she always believed Marcus would marry someone like, well, her, or at least someone who'd admire her. And I didn't. She wasn't mean in the loud way, she was subtle. Calculated. She complimented me only to undermine me later. She'd say things like, "You're surprisingly well-spoken," or, "I didn't expect you to like classical music," as if she was trying to piece together how someone like me could possibly pass as intelligent. Over the years, I learned to let most of it roll off. Not because it didn't sting, but because arguing with her was like trying to reason with a foghorn. Loud, repetitive, and pointless. Fast forward to the wedding. Marcus's younger sister, Celia, was getting married in Santa Barbara. Beautiful venue, classic Spanish estate, ocean views, tasteful decor, everything a modern, coastal wedding should be. We were all flying down for the weekend. I'd even taken a few extra days off from work to enjoy a bit of sunshine. Celia and I weren't especially close, but we got along fine. She was younger, bubbly, always in motion. I had no issues with her. She'd never been anything but polite, if a little distant. And I thought, just this once, we could have a family event without Vera trying to corner me into a power play. Foolish optimism. The night before the wedding, at the rehearsal dinner, Vera pulled me aside in the kitchen of the rental house. Her voice was honey-sweet, which I knew meant trouble. "Oh, Genevieve, I meant to tell you," she said, pretending to just remember. "We've decided to add a special touch to the ceremony." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of touch?" "Well, since you're fluent in French, and since we do have a couple of French-speaking guests coming, I thought it would be lovely if you translated the ceremony as it's happening. Just, as a service to them." I blinked. "Wait, you want me to interpret the entire wedding live?" She smiled wider. "Exactly. Just stand next to the officiant and repeat everything in French. It'll be elegant, international, and you're the perfect person for it." Now, I knew right away this wasn't about making the ceremony inclusive. Rowan, the groom, had a French cousin and an aunt from Quebec, both fluent in English. This wasn't about them. It was about me. About putting me on the spot, giving me no prep time, and waiting for me to embarrass myself in front of 100 guests. She knew there'd be no script. She knew the wind would be blowing, that I'd be in heels and a dress, that live interpretation is difficult even in controlled environments. She wanted me to stumble. But here's the thing. You don't spend 7 years translating multilingual panels on EU agricultural policy under time constraints and not develop nerves of steel. So I smiled right back. "Absolutely. I'd be honored." She tilted her head, visibly surprised. "Really? Of course." The next morning I prepared in silence. I didn't tell Marcus what had happened, he'd only worry, and I needed to be completely focused. I got up early, skipped the group breakfast, and walked along the beach rehearsing in my head. I ran through the typical ceremony structure, all the standard vows, blessings, and pronouncements, mentally aligning them with their French counterparts. I kept it simple, formal, precise. By the time the ceremony started at 3 p.m., I was calm. As guests filed into the seats on the sand, I stood to the left of the officiant, Reverend Colton, who looked unsure about the whole thing. "You've done this before?" he asked quietly. "Plenty of times," I replied. "Don't worry, just speak normally, I'll follow." And so it began. The Reverend welcomed everyone, and I echoed his words in French, projecting my voice clearly over the breeze. "We are gathered here today. Nous sommes réunis ici aujourd'hui." At first, I saw a few confused glances from the crowd. Then heads started turning toward me. Eyes widened. Conversations stopped. The shift in attention was almost physical. People leaned in. I kept translating, phrase after phrase, vow after vow, blessing after blessing. About 10 minutes in, I caught the whispering. "Wow, she's really good. Where's her notes? She's not reading. Didn't Vera say she was just, what, a librarian or something? Is she a diplomat?" Even Celia, standing at the altar in her satin gown, gave me a surprised glance and mouthed, "Thank you." I didn't trip over a single word. Not because I had anything to prove, but because I wasn't going to let Vera win. By the end, when the officiant said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," and I translated, "Je vous déclare maintenant mari et femme," I could feel the tension behind me release into applause. I stepped back quietly, letting the moment belong to the couple. But I saw Vera. She was standing with a group of her college friends. They weren't even pretending to hide their reactions. One of them looked at me and said, "Vera, I didn't know your daughter-in-law was so accomplished." Another added, "She should be doing diplomatic events. That was seamless." Vera just smiled stiffly and said, "Oh, well, she has some background in languages." Some background. The rest of the afternoon, I was asked more questions than the bride and groom. Where I'd studied, what I would do now if I still worked in translation. I told them the truth. I now manage a small bookstore, and I mostly read novels and help teenagers find the right classic for their essays. But for one moment, I was the center of their admiration. Not because I wanted to be, but because Vera had handed me the mic hoping I'd fall. And instead, I soared. She avoided me the rest of the evening. And Marcus? He finally learned the full story that night, after we were back in our room and I told him what had happened. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "She really tried to set you up, didn't she?" I just nodded. He rubbed his temples. "I'm sorry, I should have seen it coming." "It's not your fault," I said, "but she's going to think twice before doing that again." And she did. For the first time in our long, cold standoff, Vera didn't have the last word. The aftermath of the wedding became its own quiet storm, unfolding in ways I didn't expect. Vera, predictably, didn't bring up the translation at all. Not the day after the wedding. Not during the awkward family brunch where we all sat under white umbrellas eating overpriced fruit salad. Not even during her overly sentimental toast that she gave like she was performing in a Hallmark movie. She avoided eye contact with me almost entirely, save for one moment where I caught her glancing over while I helped Celia's new in-laws gather their things. When our eyes met, she looked away immediately. That was new. Vera never broke eye contact first. Celia, for her part, didn't say much about it either, but she did give me a long hug before we left the estate. And in that moment, it felt like maybe, just maybe, she saw what had happened. She leaned in and said quietly, "Thanks for being graceful. I know she can be a lot." That was more acknowledgement than I ever got before. Back home in Portland, life returned to normal. Work, errands, Marcus back to his engineering projects, me managing the store and going through our spring inventory. But the tension with Vera didn't just vanish. It shifted. She stopped calling as often. When she did, the conversations were short and clipped. She skipped the passive-aggressive comments, but not out of respect, more like she was regrouping. Her power dynamic with me had been shaken, and I think she didn't know how to respond without seeming petty. For weeks, Marcus noticed. "She hasn't asked how your store is doing," he said one evening as we cooked dinner together. "She always used to pretend she cared, just to criticize your hours." I shrugged. "Maybe she's busy." "She's never too busy to judge. I think she's mad she can't bring it up without reminding herself that you were amazing." I chuckled softly, slicing onions with unnecessary precision. "She'll find another angle. Give her time." Sure enough, the next time we saw her in person, about a month later, for Marcus's dad's birthday dinner, She greeted me with a stiff, formal smile and an overly enthusiastic, "Genevieve. Oh, I just remembered, do you still speak that? What is it again? Creole?" I paused. She said it casually but deliberately. "No," I replied evenly, "I never spoke Creole. I speak French." "Oh, right, right." She waved it off with a dismissive hand. "I get those mixed up sometimes." Marcus looked like he was about to interject, but I squeezed his hand under the table. I didn't need defending. Not now. That night, Vera tried little jabs about my European attitude, about how some people just sound smart in other languages. But the thing was, none of it landed. Her friends and extended family had seen something at the wedding she couldn't erase with snide remarks, and she knew it. After that, she shifted tactics again. Instead of undermining me, she tried to ignore me. Whenever we visited, she directed conversation toward Marcus. If I spoke, she'd nod and then change the subject. If someone asked about my work, she'd mention something irrelevant, like how Celia had started composting or how Rowan had gotten a raise. The silence was louder than the sarcasm ever was, and in a strange way, it was easier to deal with. Then, about 3 months after the wedding, I got a call from Vera out of the blue. It was early evening. I was sitting on the back porch with a book and a glass of wine, our dog asleep at my feet. I stared at her name on the screen for a good 5 seconds before answering. "Hello, Genevieve," she said, too brightly. "I need a favor." Of course she did. Apparently, one of her retirement club's planning committees was organizing a French-themed garden luncheon, whatever that meant, and they wanted someone to do a short welcome speech in French. She thought of me. "You did such a good job at the wedding," she said, like it was an afterthought. "And everyone said how sophisticated it sounded. I figured you wouldn't mind, just a quick little speech." I paused, weighing my response. "I could do that," I said slowly, "but I'd want to see the event plan first, and I'll need the script in advance. I don't do last-minute performances." Silence. "Of course," she replied, her voice tight. "That's fair." I ended the call shortly after, already knowing I wasn't going to do it. Not because I wasn't capable, because I knew what this was. She wanted to co-opt my ability now that it had social value. Now her peers were impressed. Now that it could make her look good by proximity, I didn't refuse outright, I just never followed up. A week later, she left me a terse voicemail saying they'd gone with someone else. Good. The longer this went on, the more I realized something important. Vera didn't want a daughter-in-law she respected. She wanted one she could control. And the moment I made it clear I wasn't going to play along, her whole structure began to fall apart. Marcus supported me through all of it. Quietly, steadily. I know it wasn't easy for him, navigating between the woman who raised him and the woman he chose to spend his life with. But he never asked me to shrink myself, even when he was uncomfortable with the fallout. There's something powerful in that. I'm not shrinking. And the truth is, that wedding wasn't just a turning point for Vera, it was a turning point for me. For the first time in years, I stopped tiptoeing around her moods, her games, her expectations. I started seeing her not as an immovable force, but as a woman terrified of being irrelevant. And I had made her feel irrelevant without even trying. The months rolled on after the wedding, and Vera remained cordial but cold. Her attempts to reclaim the spotlight through forced interactions or little manipulations dwindled in frequency. It was like she realized her weapons didn't work anymore. They bounced off. I didn't retaliate. I didn't gloat. But I didn't retreat either. I just kept living, unfazed by her sideways glances and offhanded comments. And that, more than any verbal sparring match, seemed to infuriate her. Marcus and I hosted Thanksgiving that year for the first time. It was something we'd talked about for a while, but I'd always been hesitant. Vera traditionally hosted it at her home in Eugene, and stepping into her territory, even in her absence, felt like inviting chaos. But this year, we did it. I cooked a mix of traditional and French-inspired dishes: rosemary turkey with a red wine reduction, herbed pommes dauphinoise, fresh green beans sautéed with garlic and shallots. Nothing flashy, just thoughtful and balanced. I set the table with dark blue linens and simple ceramic plates. We had candles, jazz, and a quiet fire going. I didn't do it to impress anyone. I did it because I love curating space. Because creating something beautiful gives me joy. But of course, Vera saw it as a challenge. She walked in that afternoon with a dessert that looked like it came from a 1970s church cookbook. some sort of gelatin thing with Cool Whip and pineapple chunks, and immediately made a point of commenting loudly that it's just not Thanksgiving without something familiar. I smiled and thanked her politely, placing it carefully on the side table. I didn't serve it. No one noticed. Dinner went off without a hitch. People ate, laughed, and lingered around the table. Even Celia and Rowan seemed at ease, asking questions about a small French vineyard Marcus and I had visited on our honeymoon. I told a story about getting lost in Lyon, and everyone laughed, except Vera, who sat with her wine glass raised and her lips pursed. At one point, Marcus's dad chuckled and said, "Vera, you should have heard Jen at the wedding. Sounded like a UN interpreter." Vera's smile froze. "Oh yes," said one of Vera's cousins, leaning forward. "I still think about that. You could hear a pin drop. It was beautiful." Vera sipped her wine and said flatly, "It was fine." And there it was, that one word, fine. It was all she had left. But the best part, the quietest, most satisfying revenge, came a few weeks later at the bookstore. I was closing up early on a Saturday afternoon when the bell above the door jingled. I turned, expecting to see a teenager rushing in for a last-minute required reading assignment. But it was Vera. She was standing awkwardly, holding a folded piece of paper in her hands. I blinked. "Hi." She glanced around at the shelves, the carefully arranged stacks, the handwritten staff recommendations. "It's nice," she said, sounding surprised. "Your store, thanks," I replied cautiously. She stepped forward and offered me the paper. "I'm leading a small discussion group at my church," she said. "We're reading The Little Prince in French and English. It was my idea. I remembered you mentioned how translation changes the meaning of certain passages, and well," I unfolded the paper. It was a paragraph from the book, printed side by side in both languages. Underneath it in shaky handwriting were her notes, questions about the phrasing, the metaphor, the choice of verbs. "I thought you might look it over," she added, "if you have time." It was a peace offering, a quiet one, but it was real. I nodded, "Sure, I'd be happy to." She didn't linger. She turned and left without waiting for approval or praise, just walked out. I never told Marcus about that moment. I didn't need to. Some things aren't meant for fanfare. A week later, I sent the paper back with notes and suggestions. She never said thank you, but she called Marcus a few days after that and told him I was very helpful. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a warm reconciliation. But it was an admission, subtle, quiet, and unmistakable, that she saw me differently now. And that was enough. Because revenge, I've learned, doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be cruel or theatrical. Sometimes, it's as simple as rising above, owning your space, and letting the people who underestimated you squirm under the weight of their own misjudgment. Sometimes, it's sitting at the head of your own table, carving the turkey while the person who tried to embarrass you watches silently from the sidelines, knowing they lost. Not because you fought, but because you didn't have to.